Hello, everyone. So tonight we're going to talk about Canada, and actually, it's one of the most important countries in the world for many different reasons. It actually has one of the world's largest economies, and it's basically one of the largest land masses on the planet. So it's a very important piece of the puzzle when you're trying to understand what's going on globally, whether it's economics or environment or just about any aspect of understanding the planet. Canada is a very big piece of that understanding. So everything we're going to talk about tonight is going to be pretty detailed. And it's basically discussing one of the most advanced economies, high incomes, and highest GDPs in the world, and also fastest growing areas in terms of economics. The average person in Canada is actually per capita is about somewhere between $60,000 and $50,000 per year. So that's pretty high when you think about some of the developing places in the world making tens of thousands of dollars a year versus $50,000 or $60,000 a year. They're doing quite well. I wanted to start with this one primarily because it shows how cold Canada is. So you can see there's kind of two lines here. There's kind of this upper line, and I would say once you get above this line, you're talking about extreme cold. I grew up in Chicago, so I kind of understand what the purple area is like, and I've ventured up into different parts of almost into Canada here, up into Lake Superior, and swum in these lakes before, so I'm pretty familiar with the border region heading into Canada. As well as I live on the west coast here in Idaho, only a few hundred miles from the Canadian border. So there's just so many things to discuss here. We're going to look at some of the main parts of the economy in Canada and kind of discover some details here that we might not have otherwise understood. So you can see that there's quite a heavy real estate part of the market here, as well as mining area. So you can also see oil and gas is pretty big here, and finance. But we're going to go back through this hopefully in detail and look at all these areas. So we're going to look at the exchange rate, Canadian dollar to US dollar, and look at what's been going on that over the years. And then kind of seeing how Canada fits into the rest of the picture of what's going on around the world, and just how much money is in Canada is kind of unbelievable, even compared to Europe. You can see Spain here is actually lower than in Portugal, and some parts of Eastern Europe are actually quite poor relative to Canada. And then you can see Australia down here, Saudi Arabia, and some parts in South America doing pretty well. So just because it is cold up there, they are still making quite a lot of money. And you can kind of see these are the states that they have, or they call them provinces. So you can see most of that money is actually coming from the Great Lakes region down in here, and actually is kind of biased towards the east coast or eastern side of Canada. And here we're going to kind of look at the details about what's going on in the imports and exports. So in terms of what Canada is exporting, you will see quite a lot of minerals and quite a lot of food. There's actually vehicles, plastics, and aluminum, and a whole other areas here. And then in terms of what Canada is paying for, this is their imports. They're actually doing quite a lot of industrial machinery, plastics, as you see, vehicles here, and they're actually importing quite a lot of food too, even despite exporting quite a lot of food. So we'll look at that in a little more detail. And then here we can see in Canada, there's basically a huge population in the United States, right? There's only about 41 million people, whereas in the United States, we're getting into 300 million plus people in the United States. So basically almost all of the people in Canada are kind of along this border here, and I kind of highlighted what's going on there. So there's quite a lot of population right in here in Canada, and then you can see there's actually another area here which I probably should have circled I'm going to just do this area as a green area so we can kind of see as an in-between area. But this area here is actually quite interesting because it's kind of the cross into the mainland farming areas of Canada. So there's actually quite a significant amount of farmland in Canada, an actual unbelievable amount of farmland actually. I will be stopping at different points. So if you have any questions, I can see all the questions as well as who is logging in to try to watch the video right now. So I will be able to kind of answer some questions. I'll hopefully monitor that as we go through this. But the population is really important to think about. It kind of gives us a best understanding of what's going on. There's kind of 3 cities over here surrounding Montreal, Toronto being the hub. But actually, even though it's financial hub, there's a lot of other parts of Canada, such as Vancouver, and even these farming areas in here, heading out from Minneapolis, St. Paul. You can kind of see this is Minneapolis, St. Paul, but actually quite a lot of people here up in Calgary and further parts of Canada. So basically the farming area being really important. We're going to try to look at the details here about what's going on in the city. So you can see Toronto, kind of some of the details here. We're going to come back to each of these to take a look at. And then Montreal, the interesting parts about Ottawa and Quebec being kind of side cities to Montreal. And then how the United States border kind of changes some of those things. So you can see the population being pretty heavy on the Canada side right along there. So, and then Vancouver being super interesting because it actually warms up quite a bit in Vancouver and Victoria here. And then its proximity to where I live personally in Seattle and other things like that. So you can see here, this is showing some of the infrastructure. So this shows quite a heavy kind of odd infrastructure heading out into these islands areas, and then even some weird stuff going on through here as well as here. So it doesn't actually follow the same pattern as the population, the infrastructure. And then if you really look at this map carefully, you can really start to understand quite a lot about Canada as well as the geology. So it's really amazing to think about all the lakes that are in Canada here. And you can see basically it drained, all these rivers kind of drain off of the mountains. And that farmland that we see in the Midwest really starts up in Canada here. And basically this is at least half of the farmland that the United States has. And it basically comes down here with the same kind of quality soil. It's not quite in the mountains here, but right on the edge. So some of that is very important to understand. And then basically half of the Great Lakes is Canada. And actually the weird thing that I didn't realize is that the drainage is actually going up north and east. So basically, although we think of the Great Lakes as kind of mainly part of the United States, it's actually draining north up into Quebec and heading out into St. Lawrence Seaway. So it's actually quite a part of Canada. Actually, the Great Lakes, some people would argue, more so than the United States. And actually, there's some really interesting things that happen when you start to understand the economy and economics. A lot of that economics, we aren't really doing a very good job of using the waterways. In the United States, Chicago really is in charge of that, but there's really not a whole lot of boating activity out on the Great Lakes right now, which could be used as a very significant transportation source. Much of the world's shipping is done by water. So actually what's happening is a lot of that goes through Vancouver. You can see the shipping lines. The green is actually cargo lines. Red is oil lines, which you don't see until you get down to Houston. You see some little red boats down there. But basically it is important to look at that. And then because so much of the economy is based on mining in Canada, they have just so much land. There's so few people relative to the United States. But the mining industry, this pink rock is actually very hard rock. Some of the hardest rock that you can possibly imagine is actually pink rock. So it's interesting that you can mine a lot of that in that region there. So there's quite a lot of different types of mining companies up in Canada. I also want to look at the road system. So you can see it pretty much just stops right when you get to the border of Canada, but there basically is quite a lot of a road infrastructure here in Quebec, Montreal, and Ottawa, and then also Toronto. And we should probably zoom in and take a careful look at that to see. And then you can see the Earth at night really gives us a very clear picture for how important all that farming land is, starting in Minneapolis and Chicago. And it's actually important to realize that this is probably more important in some senses than what's going on in the United States. Sadly, a lot of this is corn and soybean farming. Because it's so cold, they don't really do some kinds of farming that they could, but there actually is opportunities even in Chicago, because the climate is basically right in here, right around here is where the climate actually starts to drop off and the lights start to go out because it just gets to be so cold in the north there. But again, this farmland picture is very important, and then you can kind of see, if you look at the lights in Toronto, how it works, right? So you can kind of see some details about, yes, Toronto might be their business center, but actually Quebec, Montreal, and Ottawa are probably the main sources driving that finance. So even though we see a lot of that in Toronto, that may be due to New York and basically Wall Street. So basically they have a border here with New York, and some of that might be, even when I lived out in Brooklyn, a lot of people would commute from Toronto to New York. And, it's just cleaner. It's just a lot cleaner city in Toronto than it is in New York City. New York City is just vast urban sprawl with all kinds of things going on there. So, and then again, on the I wanted to really tell people how important the soil map is. So in terms of the economy, the farming, the pink land is basically what we farm in the United States. And you can see that pink stuff actually goes quite a far up into the north. And we kind of have to divide that up because at some point you're getting a little bit too cold. So it basically has to look at both the soil map and the temperature map. And you can't farm on this green area, unfortunately, because the rock is so solid. It's actually just like it is up in Norway, which is actually very mountainous. So it's not as mountainous up here, but the rock is very solid because this used to be the tallest mountains in the world. It used to be the Appalachian Mountains. And then as the earth shifted and the Appalachians went down, and basically now we have Himalayas being the largest mountains in the world, but they used to be over here, and there is a lot of solid rock still remaining, and not too much dirt. But this map really should be looked at really carefully, because we can really start to understand what's going on in Canada, whether you live in Chicago or even almost in New York. So New York City is actually a little bit on the warmer side of this line, but Chicago, if you're familiar with Chicago, which is where I was born and raised, you know what the temperature is like. So it actually is very hot in the summertime. So even though it gets so cold in the wintertime, it gets 90 degrees or more in the summertime sometimes. So it's very kind of a mysterious climate to think about. So we're going to go back through everything in detail. I'm going to pause this momentarily to let people catch up and see if there's any questions or things going on. So I wanted to mention how surprising it is to look at the currency. So if you haven't done this before, I definitely recommend taking a look at TradingView and drawing some of your diagrams on top of this to try to see what's going on in the economy right now. So you can see that actually they've made a lot of progress until about 2015. And then everything in the last 5 years has basically been getting into some trouble, and actually the last 10 years, right? So basically, the economy has kind of fallen apart, and that does mean that people from the outside may have a better opportunity than people on the inside of Canada. So you basically may have a good opportunity to work with Canada because they are looking to strengthen their economy. Now, what happened is it looks like back in the 1990s, basically they're going back in time to what the currency value was. So where you had 1-to-1 with the dollar back here, and even there was partly like in 2011, you had the Canadian dollar was even worth more than the US dollar. So that's a pretty important time frame. Here you can see the MACD charges, so you can kind of see that this was a very bad, very, very bad time for the Canadian economy. Was 2016, and we would have to look at essentially right around here, 2015, to see what really happened. So you may want to look at Canadian news sources, Wikipedia, and kind of study up what happened there. And the other thing is what really rocked the Canadian economy was starting in 2002. Some of that was the layoffs that you saw in the technology industry in the United States. So as the United States kind of fell apart, Canada went way up. So that's something to really think about as we see the economy in the United States or even in Europe. Although it's just one country, Canada is huge. So if there is problems in one country, sometimes those can be benefited in other countries because some of the labor and projects move to, for example, Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver. So specific cities should be looked into carefully. And you can see there's that major drop here right around 2008. That would be one thing to look at too. That almost fell what it was here, right? So this is actually part of the problem. Could be understood right in here with their economy. So this is a very detailed diagram. I definitely recommend looking at that in detail to see. Let's just dive into some of the companies that are pretty important in Canada. So I was pretty surprised that just the finance industry, banking, unfortunately what's going on with Toronto is that it's so close to New York that the main industries in Canada that are really getting all this money are the housing industry as well as the finance industry. But the big support for the economy is coming primarily from the minerals. So you see that here, that 25% of the economy is basically minerals and mining, precious metals down in here as well as all this stuff. So if you take this plus this, you basically have the stable part of the economy and then the banking side of the economy being on the business side here, not really maybe providing all the true wealth that we see in Canada. So actually food, I was really surprised buying some candy at the local Winco here in town, the local grocery store, and it was basically from Canada. And then I went to the next piece, and that was also from Canada. So we are pretty close to Canada here, but actually it's probably likely that many of the foods are manufactured in Canada that you wouldn't really realize. Let's just continue on with this a little bit. So when we look at imports and exports, it's important to look at the imports too, because sometimes these are where the opportunities, because they want to do local projects. So let's say you call up someone in Canada, they're going to want to do a project with you if they're, like plastics, industrial machinery, vehicles, and electrical machinery. So these kind of areas would actually give you very good opportunities. And actually these would be probably not so great. Maybe tourism might be interesting, or insurance, or transport. But you have to kind of look at both the export and import map. And I did not really do the whole thing here. Let me show you the full thing so you can see. So there is quite a number of ways to look at this. This is the importer from Canada. I'm going to draw the whole map here. It might take a moment to load. Unfortunately, the computer's kind of slow here, so we might not be able to do that right now. Sorry about that. Alright, so here you go. So here you have importer, Canada, and then all products. And it's probably better to do exports. So you can see that most of the goods are actually coming from China and the United States, and even more so from the United States. So basically, if you are in the United States, that means that basically this is definitely great business for you. If you live in Germany, you're definitely thinking about doing business with Canada, Japan, and some other areas. So the reason you look at this map is basically wherever you are in the world, Africa, South America, these are all the trading partners for Canada. Now if I switch this to exports, this would be how you would sell things from the country. So basically, the United States is huge again, and that's one of the main reasons I wanted to discuss this whole topic tonight, is because we're so close to Canada, and yet sometimes we forget how important Canada is. But basically, you also see some stuff going into England here, and so some trading partners where you may not quite expect, even up into Norway and some other areas, Ireland, and even places in Northern Africa and South America and Australia and India. So definitely take a look at these maps as well. The trade over time maps are pretty interesting too to look at. Sorry this is taking a little bit of time to load. I was going to try to grab these ahead of time. But this shows you some of the weaknesses and areas that they would have trading partners. So really in the Americas, that means South America and North America, right, is a big part of where the trading is happening here. That's over 50%. So that's if you're exporting. And then on the import side, we may see still, because the United States is on this, but we see kind of a different picture here where you have other. This is meaning there's unusual countries that you might not expect. Europe and then Asia. So something to take a look at. And then global share, this is helpful to see per industry. So sometimes this doesn't load up properly. Looks like it's not going to load up properly here for me. Sorry about that. Load this back into Canada again. Let's see. I'm going to pause this for a moment. Now to get this main map, what I did here, there's actually a couple things you might want to do. I did 2-digit codes on this to make it a little bit more visible, but you actually, if you're doing this at home, you may not want to do that. And the other thing is net is very important. So here's where you start to see how important the mining industry and oil industry is for Canada. It's almost 56% in the business. So they're basically making no profit. All the profit is coming from food and the mining industry. So I almost should have showed this map before, but it's just so unbelievable that you don't really realize how important this map is. Let me split this again. So this is on the import side. So there's a lot more diversity here. And I believe this is still on net. So this is the profitability on the import side. Industrial machinery, electronics, and vehicles. So you can see that, and then plastics right in here. So if you're trying to import products, and that pretty much goes true around the world, electronics, vehicles, industrial machinery, there's a lot of money to be made in those areas. So definitely take a look at that. And here's kind of an overlay so you can see kind of where the region is of Canada. And again, I really wanted to get into some of the relief maps here so you can kind of see. Again, you may want to take a careful look at this to kind of get some ideas. And then here's the infrastructure map. So we did look kind of at some of the details in this, and I want to zoom in so you can see. So basically the electrical just pretty much drops right where that climate also drops into the freezing cold. And it's actually a little bit above that. I would say the climate, this does go into some of the very, very cold areas. But it kind of gives you this middle portion here, kind of out of Duluth, Minnesota, right? So they have maybe a power supply region right in here, coming up through there. So I kind of tried to highlight that, and I really wanted to emphasize these islands out here. So there's really some cool stuff going on in Canada. The United States really doesn't have any islands. We basically have Puerto Rico that we work with, and then that's about it. So there's maybe Hawaii out here, but that's a small island. But in Canada, they have this whole Vancouver Island, and then they have Newfoundland up here, and this other island right in here. So that's something definitely to take a look at. Big island culture. These are the size of entire countries. At least the size of the combined size of like England or even Iceland and Ireland. So they're very big islands and super cool cities that I've kind of checked out in the past. So if you are doing business there's definitely some opportunities outside of these main Great Lakes area. And also to think about this is that you basically have a lot of fresh water. You cannot see across any of these Great Lakes. It actually feels like the ocean. You can get waves that are bigger. I've been down in Miami, and the waves sometimes in Chicago are bigger in Chicago than they are off the coast of Miami. So there's actually very big waves, and it's big water out here. So something to think about as you're looking for projects to work on. Now, this actually can be very helpful. So the road maps are also something that I wanted to look at in detail. So if you look at the details here, you can see Minneapolis, Minnesota, and then you basically have that line where you get into Canada, and it actually looks pretty continuous. You can't even see the line here along the border too easily. So it basically Winnipeg is right here, and then you start getting into other Calgary. So all that is basically a lot of electricity. And incidentally, it doesn't really look too much like, you can kind of see this electrical map here, but the real electrical map, in terms of the fine details, should probably have looked at on the Earth at Night map, and it can definitely give you some clues. Here you can see the 3 islands, and I highlighted that out by Vancouver and Vancouver Island, Victoria, so you can kind of compare some of the regions here. And I definitely recommend zooming in and kind of looking at how each city works. So perhaps the biggest misunderstanding about Canada is actually with the rock and the geology, right? So you can't really understand Canada without understanding basically the weather and the climate, and combining that with basically the Great Lakes, and then these coastal islands and some other areas that you wouldn't really quite understand Canada without understanding the temperature and the geology here. So the mining industry, because it's almost 50% of the industry in terms of profit of that industry, as we saw. So the net is a little bit different than the total sales. So basically, the net profit is sometimes more important, because those industries that are profitable are probably better to try to get involved in. So that's an important map to look at. And again, here's this climate map, and you can kind of see Alaska, because the mountain range gets into this complex. The tallest of the mountains are going to be really cold up in here, and then some of that climate actually makes it through here. And you can see, I would definitely recommend not getting too far above this purple line. So if you are, fortunately, I've survived in Chicago for more than half of my life, and it is very nice in the summertime. Actually, the water is too cold to swim in up in Duluth, but these other parts of the Great Lakes are really warm, and you can definitely enjoy the water in the summertime. So I was just going to see who's online here. Looks like a friend of mine from California, just posting, and some different people from around the United States, as around the world. And, you know, there's just so many things to look at when you try to understand the entire planet. So the climate is something to for sure think about. But if you think about the electricity, that actually gives you quite a good perspective on Canada as well as the United States. So again, we're talking about quite a lot of farmland area and cities that depend on the farmland. And really, when you think about the United States, a big part of our entire economy is farming as well, pretty much all around here. And these coastal cities all depend on that farming, food, and other agriculture. So, but once you get up into Canada, the rock becomes so solid. There's also the mining industry. So a lot of these little towns up into here are mining towns. So if you do some research and look at top companies in Canada, if you're trying to invest in them, or if you're just trying to get to know who to work with, a lot of them will be mining companies, and they'll have little airports kind of out in the middle of nowhere. So but anyway, so I hope you enjoyed this study of Canada. Let me know what you're thinking about in terms of the entire planet. There's so much to study. Really, When you look at Canada, it's got a huge landmass area here. It's a lot like a lot of people in the United States, including my uncle and various family members, have lived up in Alaska. I grew up in Chicago, and basically it's just our neighbor here. So, super important place, one of the wealthiest places in the world, even ahead of many places in Europe. And so, something super important to think about. Hope you enjoyed this discussion. Thank you so much.